An inconceivably brutal crime rocks the small town of Mount Vernon, New Hampshire. Police and residents alike are desperate to stop the monsters before they can strike again. But as the haunting case begins to unravel, they soon realize that no one could have prevented the truly evil acts that were about to be set in motion. As it would turn out, a group known as the Disciples of Destruction would stop at nothing to make their twisted dreams of violence, horror, and gore a sick reality. And yet, not everything went according to their plan. The killers soon learned that one of their victims was actually still alive. Home to around 2,000 people, Mount Vernon is most notable for its quaint and quiet reputation. With little to no crime, it was never expected that the tranquil town would be the setting of one of the most shocking murder cases that the nation has ever seen. Among the community lived the Cates family, including 42-year-old Kimberly, her husband David, and their daughter, 11-year-old Jamie. They resided among a beautiful neighborhood located on Trow Road, where the growing forestry made for a peaceful stretch of land. Kimberly was a pediatric nurse and David was an engineer. But the most fulfilling job that the two shared was being parents to the bright and outgoing Jamie. They were a happy family, but sadly, they could not have foreseen the horrors that were in their near future. It wasn't uncommon for David to travel on occasional business trips, leaving Kimberly and Jamie at home. But he'd installed an alarm system inside of the house that would contact the local authorities in the unlikely event of an emergency. And to further their peace of mind, Kimberly had also made an agreement with one of their neighbors, promising to keep an eye on each other's property. Although due to the town's low crime rate, the idea that residents of Trow Road could be targeted victims of crime was never considered. Before David left for his trip on Saturday, October 3, 2009, the house's alarm system had unexpectedly malfunctioned, rendering it inoperable. Despite this, the family remained unconcerned, but as David walked out that door for yet another work trip, he couldn't have ever imagined that the world he knew was about to be tragically ripped away from him. It was another typical weekend for the mother-daughter duo, where they made plans to shop at their local mall the next day, and possibly stop by Jamie's karate studio. At least, that's what Kimberly had messaged to David before she and Jamie went to bed around 8:30. Jamie would often sleep in her parents' bedroom while David was gone, and this weekend was no different. From the hotel in Maryland, David messaged his family a good night. Around 4 in the morning on October 4th, 2009, a chilling 911 call was made to a local dispatcher. The voice was that of a little girl, soft and quiet and very hard to hear. But what the dispatcher could make out was the whimpering cries of a terrified child begging for help. Unable to gain a clear understanding of what the little girl had been saying, a police officer was immediately sent to the address of 4 Trow Road. Upon arrival, the officer briefly searched the exterior of the home while waiting for the other squadrons to show. Before he was able to make a full circle of the property, he noticed a slight movement out of the corner of his eye, coming from inside of the house. Inching closer to the home, he peered through a kitchen window, where he located a vague image. Someone appeared to be hiding behind the counter. Locking eyes with the petrified little girl, the officer was overcome with a wave of horror at what was before him. The girl was lying on the floor, her entire body coated in blood, and a portion of her foot had been severed. Someone had maimed the vulnerable child. Breaking down the front door, the officer finally gained entry inside, where he found the little girl, shaking and paralyzed by fear. Horrifyingly, she was attempting to scream and yell. However, nothing was coming out. When she could finally speak, she quickly gave her name, Jamie. The officer immediately carried Jamie outside, where he asked if any other people were in the house. She responded by saying that only her mother was in the bedroom. However, in a heartbreaking plea, she begged him not to leave her side. The officer comforted the young girl, stating that he needed to search the residence for anyone who may be hurt. and promised that she was safe. Just outside, another officer made their way to the petrified Jamie, where they could see that not only had her foot been severed, but she had suffered multiple lacerations to her head, legs, arms, and torso. When asked how she received the injuries, she responded by saying, "Some guy had a knife and another one had a bat and he hit my mom." Horrified, the officer asked if Jamie had any idea of who the perpetrators were, and although she couldn't identify any of her attackers, she recalled that one had been bald. However, she also told the authorities one of them said, "Get the jewelry." She then told the police that she survived by pretending that she was dead. Soon, additional help had arrived, and it was then that they discovered all of the appalling contents waiting within the home. Authorities were able to follow the blood-stained footprints across the hallway carpet that led all the way back to the master bedroom. What they found upon entry could only be described as a chamber of horror. Not a single member of law enforcement could fathom the massive amounts of blood that had encompassed almost every inch of the room. And then they found something even more disturbing. The officers could barely stomach the absolute atrocity that was before them. Lying on the blood-soaked bed was Jamie's mother, Kimberly, who had been savagely murdered. Severely wounded Jamie was immediately rushed to the hospital, but there was no telling whether she would survive. Following the sickening discovery, the authorities were left with a mountain of questions. Most importantly, they needed to uncover who had unleashed such an evil attack upon a mother and her child. In an attempt to establish the motive, they began to search the house, and they discovered that various items of jewelry had been taken. In addition, they found that the basement window had been broken into, with the screen laying neatly on the ground. Along with this, the air conditioning unit that had been placed in a window above the deck was missing, yet another potential entry point to the home. South of the residence, tire tracks could be seen along the dirt pathway, and foot imprints were located within the front yard. As word of the brutal attack spread, the tight-knit community was plagued with fear. But what became even more frightening was the haunting whispers making their way to Mount Vernon from the nearby town of Brookline, only 20 minutes away. Apparently, a resident had been visiting a friend's house on Sunday, October 4th, and was introduced to a pair of young men, also from Brookline. Initially, the gathering seemed to be a harmless occasion, but that would quickly take a dark and unexpected turn. Within a short amount of time, the new friends had divulged a sick and twisted secret. They claimed that they had just killed a mother and her child, while another set of friends watched. The other patrons sat in disbelief as they listened to what they thought had been a scare tactic from the two, or a cruel joke. But as you'll come to find out, the truth behind this harrowing case would only emerge after a series of horrific findings. It's possible that the high of committing the crime had worn off, so the assailants were attempting to relive the attack and experience that rush again by describing it to friends. They likely enjoyed the attention and shock from the others, and were potentially confident that there was no evidence linking them to the crime, suggesting that they may have believed they were smarter than police. However, they weren't smart enough as authorities caught wind of the chilling rumors, and were in a mad dash to track down the mysterious young men. They would turn out to be 19-year-old Christopher Gribble and 17-year-old Stephen Spader. One day after the horrific crime, they were each brought in for questioning. It was rather odd that Christopher, of all people, had been asked to talk with the police, considering his background. A long-time Eagle Scout, Christopher was a proud member of the Mormon Church and was working towards his goal of becoming a missionary. He'd been homeschooled from an early age, where his parents worked tirelessly to instill the proper values. This had also coincided with Christopher's time in the Boy Scouts, where he'd given back to his community, supposedly building a shed for the Brookline transfer station, a drop-off site for waste and recyclables. Although things weren't always as picture-perfect as they seemed. It was no secret that Christopher had struggled with the social portion of his life, where making friends became an almost impossible task. The few that he did have recall his awkward demeanor and tendency to ramble during conversation. On top of this, social cues were somewhat of a foreign concept to the Eagle Scout, making for a rather difficult childhood. Human beings have a fundamental need to connect with other people. When someone is unable to or has great difficulty forming even platonic relationships, this can be a red flag for a personality disorder. Nonetheless, he carried on with his aspirations of one day becoming a Marine and enrolled in the U.S. Army Cadet Corps Group in Nashua, New Hampshire. There, he won the Academic and Good Conduct Honors Award. Unfortunately, the excellent student would find himself failing out of the training course in 2008. It was around this time that Christopher's friends and family noticed an odd shift in his behavior, and you'll soon find out exactly why that is. The date is October 5th, 2009, only one day after Kimberly's body has been found. The detective reads Christopher his Miranda rights before jumping right into the much-anticipated interrogation. The following never-before-heard interviews have been analyzed by a qualified team, including a licensed attorney, a licensed clinical psychologist, a former licensed professional counselor, and a licensed professional counselor. A pair of friends had supposedly visited a couple of local yard sales, but were unable to find anything worth purchasing. Following the unsuccessful shopping spree, Christopher drove Stephen back home. But this wouldn't be the last that they see of each other on this day. When the detective questions Christopher about whether that's actually what they did, Christopher avoids answering the question directly, which is a red flag for possible deception. He may be trying to buy some time to think about what he should say. In addition, he mentions two new people, 17-year-old Quinn Glover and 18-year-old William Marks, also known as Billy, who'd been part of a friend group with Christopher and Stephen, although Billy and Christopher had only just met a week prior. Christopher uses a selective memory statement of "I think," and then a qualifier of "pretty sure," which are additional red flags for possible deception. The event he's describing was only 2 days ago, so it's something he should remember and be certain about. He may realize that if he wants to play it off as though he has a bad memory, then he needs his memory to be poor on days that don't involve crime and murder. However, the detective will likely be able to confirm or deny Christopher's recount of events based on possible surveillance footage or eyewitness statements, which Christopher may be realizing now. Someone who's being deceptive is more likely to give evasive answers. They want to leave open the possibility to change their story if needed, such as if a detective presents evidence that they were actually somewhere different than they said. If a suspect gives a definite alibi with no room for alterations, then it'll be much more difficult to adjust the story later on. In addition, Christopher may feel like he needs to be cautious about what he says in case one of his friends gives a different account. Next, he states that they made their way to another friend's house, 19-year-old Autumn Savoy. At Autumn's, Christopher recalls that they watched the popular show Dexter, and he begins to describe his fascination with the series. What comes off as somewhat creepy is Christopher's interest in the character and the fact that he's going into such detail about the show. It seems that he doesn't think this will make him look at all suspicious, even continuing to state that they watched several hours of the show before he and Stephen slept in his car, which the detectives find to be rather odd. The pair had supposedly left Autumn's place around 7 or 8 in the morning, before Christopher drove Stephen back to his house. They met again later that afternoon at 1:30 and visited more local yard sales. It turns out that they were in desperate need of money, and, just as their luck would have it, Christopher stated that they were able to purchase a decent amount of jewelry for only $20 from one sale in particular. Now, we will find out exactly what they did with the newfound merchandise, while getting to meet our additional suspect, Stephen. The detective asks similar questions to that of Christopher's interrogation, where Stephen gives the same story. When a suspect acts defensive, such as Stephen is doing here, this can be a red flag for deception, but his age may be a factor in his behavior. The logical part of the brain, known as the prefrontal cortex, isn't fully developed until around the age of 25, and even a few years later for men, which can partially explain why teenagers and children tend to act based on their emotions rather than thinking things through. It's also possible that Stephen sees the interview as a big inconvenience for him. Christopher and Stephen had only recently become friends again, after previously meeting during their time in the Boy Scouts. Years later, they would somehow reconnect, bonding over the same interests, and Stephen, just like his friend, had grown up with issues of his own. As Stephen's mother was allegedly struggling with addiction during her pregnancy, Stephen tested positive for illegal substances upon his birth, but would go on to beat the odds and was adopted by a loving family at only 5 days old. During his childhood years, Stephen was a picture of happiness, outgoing and personable, given every opportunity in life. He participated in various sports and joined both the Boy Scouts and a theater group, all of which gave him the chance to make friends. But once he approached his teenage years, it was like a switch had gone off. In an instant, the once lovable boy turned cold and became uncontrollable. This would later be confirmed through one of his close friends, Autumn, who had much to say about the troubled young man. His mood swings could happen in the blink of an eye, leaving his friends and family to walk on eggshells. But even worse, Stephen was developing violent tendencies. His mother, Christine Spader, noted that at one point, Stephen had punched a wall out of sheer frustration. During a most memorable incident, Stephen and his father were having a heated argument, and the teenager, engulfed in rage, allegedly pulled out a knife. He started to associate with kids from different high schools, where he apparently joined a gang known as the Crips, although his father, also named Stephen, believed this to be nothing but teenage nonsense. In addition, he would take recreational and prescription drugs in order to help with his supposed anxiety. Stephen's parents grew increasingly worried about their rebellious teen and finally took him to see a psychiatrist in 2006. Stephen's behavior indicates that he was showing signs of having conduct disorder. Sometimes when behavioral problems are sudden and severe, like in Stephen's case, it occurs due to some sort of trauma or major stressor in the young person's life. And because Stephen was heading down such a dangerous path, his parents reportedly spent thousands of dollars in an attempt to help their son. However, he was eventually diagnosed with bipolar disorder and major depression. They would apparently go so far as to enroll him in an addiction treatment center, but were devastated to learn that he required a higher level of treatment than the facility could offer. Stephen was then taken to a residential treatment center, but left within a month, yet another failed resource. He even spent a few short days in psychiatric hospitals in 2008, and supposedly ran away with his girlfriend later that year, but was found in New York and returned home within days. It seemed that there was nothing left to try, but the devoted parents would never give up on their child, although not a single thing could have prevented the heinous acts of the monster that was about to be unleashed. This may be an example of the prisoner's dilemma, in which Stephen now faces the decision of whether to confess or to stick with his story. If Billy says nothing and Stephen says nothing, it's possible that there is not enough evidence to tie them to the crime, and they'll face no punishment. However, if Billy has talked and implicated Stephen, it's possible that Stephen could face a harsher punishment if he doesn't give his side of the story. But if Stephen confesses his role and Billy has admitted his part as well, they will likely both be punished. The prisoner's dilemma is such an effective tactic because Stephen is separated from the others. He doesn't know what they're saying or if they've cracked under the pressure. If he knew for sure the others weren't talking, he would feel more confident in keeping his original story. But the seeds of doubt are likely gnawing at him now, leaving him panicking about what to do. Frustrated, the detectives must end the interrogation. It's possible that Stephen refuses to believe his friend has betrayed him, but, as we will later hear from Billy, he was ready to come clean. In the meantime, there are still a few things that Christopher's interrogators would like to cover. The confrontation phase of the interrogation is now underway, but Christopher maintains his original story, although the detectives aren't buying it.
For today, we will like to stop here. Watch out for the next episodes of the remaining crime story.